Hi, good morning, everyone. To the west, good morning, and midday to those of us on the East Coast. Thank you for joining us for our sixth broadcast of City Talks. I'm Mary Rowe, the CEO at the Canadian Urban Institute, and we're very happy to have you all joining us today. I just want to acknowledge, though, that this is a very somber time, particularly for Atlantic Canada. CUI is in the connective tissue business, and we have many colleagues and friends and family who are deeply affected by the tragedy that unfolded in Nova Scotia this weekend. And we just wanted to take a moment to acknowledge that in addition to all the challenges that COVID-19 is posing on people all around the world, to have this kind of unspeakable violent tragedy unfold has just brought into sharp relief how vulnerable we all are. And so we send our hearts and support to our colleagues and friends and ISIP family in Nova Scotia as they come to terms with this unspeakable event. These sessions are part of a series on Candid Conversations, and we are doing them generally on Tuesdays, Thursdays, and Fridays, and generally around midday. Sometimes the schedules vary depending on the availability of the participants, but generally that's what's happening. So many of you are coming and joining us either at lunchtime, as I said, in Eastern, or if you're in the West Coast for a cup of coffee, to explore and try to make some sense and get some meaning out of what's going on in different disciplines and different aspects of urban life. You will look you'll see in your mailbox every Monday morning, you'll get an email telling you what the actual topics are. If you're not on our mailing list, I hope you'll make sure you are so that you can receive these directly. But just so you know, you can hold Tuesdays, Thursdays, and midday Eastern and Friday. This is really an all hands on deck moment. We acknowledge this, and we also want to just make it clear that there are thousands and thousands of people working in communities around the world, but in North America, we have American participants today, and in Canada on the first lines, and they are dealing with life and death situations all the time. And these discussions are not in any way intended to impede that. We appreciate that people have been redeployed into emergency services, and we just carry these conversations on in parallel, recognizing that that many folks are responding on the ground to pretty desperate situations. These conversations are about practical observations about what we're seeing and what the implications are in the immediate, slightly longer term over the next few months, and then ultimately in terms of how we conduct our work as urbanists. And it's really about, as I suggested, what's working, what's not, and what's next, and particularly what people are seeing. And we're very appreciative today that we have 4 folks who have been active on the sustainability and resilience front for several years. Not that they're old or anything, but as it turns out, I've known a few of them a few years. And this has been a life's work for you folks. And we're very appreciative that you take time to just have a conversation with us about what are really 2 emergencies, 2 crises that are colliding, and probably 3 or 4, but the 2 that we put in the title were climate change and COVID, and how this has, how these challenges are now cascading on us, and what are the implications in terms of all the other vulnerabilities that we're seeing exposed. I had used this language a few weeks ago that COVID was a particle accelerator, taking every pre-existing condition in urban life and blowing it right out of the water to really see fully where our dysfunctions were. And we're seeing that, I think, so clearly as we see which communities are the most hardest hit by this. We have partners for this particular session, and all of you out there, if you've got sessions that you want us to do, and if you want to partner with us, please get in touch with us. And in fact, all the work that CUI has been doing over the last, since COVID, has been powered by the efforts of volunteers and partners and various organizations, and we're very appreciative of them. And if you want to get engaged with us on citywatchcanada.ca or citysharecanada.ca, or you want to suggest how we might do a city talk together, please email us at covidresponse@canurb.org. Now we're broadcasting, I'm in Toronto, and one of our panelists is in Toronto, but others are across the country. But to acknowledge, just for us, where we're originating this broadcast, this is the traditional territory of the Mississaugas of the Credit, and the Anishinaabeg and the Chippewa and the Haudenosaunee. and the Wendat peoples, and we're now home to many diverse First Nations, Inuit and Métis here in Toronto, peoples from across Turtle Island. We also acknowledge that Toronto was covered by Treaty 13, signed with the Mississaugas of the Credit, and the Williams Treaties signed with multiple Anishinaabe nations. And we are very cognizant of the reality of the terra firma that we occupy here in Toronto. And my colleagues, as I suggest, also are speaking to us from other traditional territories. So the folks that we have on here are, as I suggested, been working in this trench for a while. And I know that you're going to want to exchange views with each other. So we encourage you to use the chat function. And when you chat, you can, first of all, you'll see the details on the four guests. But also when you chat, could you use your toggle switch to chat to offer comments to all participants, not just to the panelists, because it'd be best if all of you talk to each other, because we're finding these chat rooms are really, really rich for people to exchange experience and questions and resources. And what you put up there lives there. So just keep that in mind. You can't retract the chat comment. And we're trying to digest the chats and repost them. And we're similarly taking transcripts of the sessions and in some cases videos of the sessions, and we're reposting them at canurb.org, because this is really the beginning of a conversation. And we are needing to learn like crazy on the ground, real time. And so the more we can expose what our thoughts are and be transparent about what we're all struggling with, I think the more we can collectively learn. So joining us, or recording this session, Sue, that's the other point I should just mention. And if you want to tweet, please knock yourselves out. Hashtag CityTalk. And as I suggested, this is just the beginning of a conversation that we want to have last for as long as we need it to last for. So joining us from actually working in New York City, Jeff Hebert, but at the moment in New Orleans. Jeff Hebert, who's with HR&A and was the previous Chief Resilience Officer for New Orleans. I think you were the first Chief Resilience Officer, as I recall. Elliott Cappell, who is was also a former Chief Resilience Officer. You're going to have a little club, you guys. Former CROs, formerly known as CRO. Elliott Cappell, who was the CRO in Toronto, who's now at WSP. Laurian Farrell, who is a Torontonian. We're going to claim you forever, Laurian, although now living in New York City with the Global Resilient City Network, which is the sort of successor to the 100 Resilient Cities Initiative, and Allison Ashcroft, who is our beloved partner in Victoria. As I suggested, we have partners for this broadcast, which include Allison's organization that she leads, the Canadian Urban Resilience Practitioner Network. We also have Evergreen and Future Cities and the Canadian Urban Resilience Accelerator as part of the organizations that were helping us put this session together and who are carrying on the work as we go. So these are the big four that we've got with us this morning, and very pleased to have you be part of this conversation with us at this particularly challenging time. And I just got to say that I'm here in Toronto, and a hailstorm blitzed through Toronto about, at least my part of Toronto, about 5 minutes ago. So if you're further east than me, you're going to get it next. And it's part of the little microclimates that we're observing and all the changes. Who knows what's the next? Jeff, I want to go to you first. I think I've known you the longest. You and I were in New Orleans together after Katrina. Mm-hmm. And so I want to just start with each person and ask them to give us 2 minutes on what are you seeing? What are you observing in terms of your practice as a resilience and sustainability practitioner? Over to you, Jeff, first.
Yep. Thanks, Mary, and thanks, everyone. You know, it's interesting, as Mary said, you know, we worked together in New Orleans after Katrina. I was in New York during 9/11. And then we've seen, you know, Hurricane Sandy, Harvey, Maria, wildfires in the West and in Australia. And now we have COVID-19. And I think what's very different, what we're all grappling with that's very different about this, is that this is a much different protracted emergency response phase. It's not sort of a shock like a hurricane or a tornado or those sorts of events. This is very different because it's much more protracted, and the response phase is going to go on for some time. And particularly here in the US, depending on what the federal government and the state governments do, you know, we will either be able to contain this for some time, or depending on what different states decide to do, this could continue for some time, which makes this a very, very different situation than we're used to handling. As we move through this, though, I've been thinking about this as sort of a process. And, the process of this response phase, thinking about how it can move into a stabilization phase and hopefully into an adaptive recovery. Because what we do know is that what has happened with COVID, what has happened previously with all the other issues, Katrina in particular, but also Sandy, Harvey in Houston, Maria in Puerto Rico, is that these shocks expose and exacerbate pre-existing terrible conditions, particularly for vulnerable populations, and particularly in the context of the US, people of color. So what hopefully we are able to move forward with is pivoting to something that is much more just and resilient in this recovery phase, that will be able to move us from the conditions that existed before and are continuing to exist presently to a not business as usual case moving forward, where we can start to address some of those underlying inequities that are causing the issues that we see today. The last thing I'll say, Mary, that is very concerning to me is, particularly in the US context, we have a very stretched emergency management system right now. And we are on the precipice of moving into the summer season with heat and the exposure of high heat, which happens all across the country, the Atlantic hurricane season starting in June, and wildfires in the West. And we have many places in this country that have been recovering for the past couple of years from issues that result from the summer season. So all of this at the same time, we could be entering a phase of compounding shocks, which greatly concerns me for those vulnerable populations that are on the front lines, number one, and also are overly exposed as it stands right now with COVID.
Thanks, Jeff. I mean, it's interesting in Canada, we're a little further north, we have flooding issues too. We're expecting spring floods. So as you suggest, it just compounds and compounds, doesn't it? Yeah. Okay, let's go to the other side of the country. Allison, let's go to you in Victoria. I was teasing when we were getting together at first, just now, that you're looking at beautiful roses while I'm looking at a hailstorm. But just give us a picture from not only what you're seeing in Victoria, but also across your network, which is a robust network across the country.
Sure, yes. The CUSP network is comprised of 17 cities across the country from coast to coast, and I work with those sustainability directors in those cities. So, for sure, we're seeing a lot of mirroring between the work that we're doing on climate action and what we're seeing here with COVID, or seeing, like Jeff was saying, some of the same repercussions. So we're seeing that the response has been local, and that the recovery needs to be too, because the impact on people is contextual to place. Mm-hmm. We're seeing that impacts are felt disproportionately, just like Jeff was referring to. And we're seeing an outsized role for municipalities with undersized resources, just like is the case with our work in climate action. So municipal finance, I think, is one of the greatest risks at this very moment around how we're going to stay on target with our climate action work. Cities are the ones who are taking the lead on climate action, and when we are distracted by and understandably distracted by the COVID crisis, that takes away our resources, both financial and human.
Yeah, I just want to thank you for correcting me. It's the Canadian Urban Sustainability Practitioners Network. I abbreviated you right incorrectly. And also ICLEI, the International Council for Local Environmental Initiatives, has also been a partner with us on this. And it is interesting, as you suggest, Allison, the way in which, back to the pre-existing conditions, Jeff, if cities were under-resourced before, they're really under-resourced now, right? Okay, let's go next to Elliott, who's in what looks like a sunny part of Toronto, and who used to be the CRO for Toronto. What are you seeing, Elliott?
I'll just build on what Jeff and Allison have said. With my focus is on working with Canadian cities on climate change, but focus on climate resilience. I would say big picture things are still moving. We kicked off a project with the town in Quebec. We're working with some cities in Ontario. So things are still moving. It's not totally seized up. I'm excited that the ambition is still there. We're working with the city of Kingston that has an incredibly ambitious climate leadership plan, and they haven't wavered through this. There haven't been delays in the timetable either. It's very impressive work from the city of Kingston. I think what we're seeing practitioners struggle with is how to talk about the two emergencies, because on the one side, a lot of the say justification originally for the climate action planning that's happening right now in cities was that there was a climate emergency, and council said, come back to us in 6 months or a year with a plan. Now they are in a state of emergency, and it's tricky to talk about two different types of things with very similar nomenclature.
Yeah.
Just to respond very quickly to just the point around resources, Jeff mentioned, stretched emergency management related to things like, in our context, the spring floods. We've done a bit of research on that, and we'll share it online through my Twitter so that people can access that, highlighting flooding, heat, and the other things that practitioners can look out for right now. Might not be a terrible spring flood season. We hope we've got some good indicators there. But one of the comments that was made was that the COVID-19 response takes away resources from the climate response. And while I don't necessarily disagree with that, we do see some evidence where on the resilience side, some of the work that we've done, either the thinking or the people that we've trained up, or people that are in, say, resilience functions within municipalities, are being pulled into the emergency response. And so while on the one side, you may be taking them away from the climate response, you are also applying that thinking into municipal emergency management, which is, I think, a positive thing that we can take away.
No, I would totally agree with you on that one, Elliott, for sure. We're seeing, Katie in Vancouver and other folks who've worked on resilience and equity work, and those who've worked kind of on the front line around social justice have been pulled into the front and into the core response teams, because they have those connections and they have those skills to respond to this crisis, for sure. It's more the longer term range planning, which has become which, like you said, people are still working towards them, but finances will determine how fast we do that. And some of the risks, like the occupation of time and resources at the federal level means that we're not stepping up our ambitions at the federal level. We're not updating our NDCs this year, our nationally determined contributions. COP26 at a global level has been canceled. So there is just some timelines that are being staggered here, understandably, that we need to catch up on.
So I'm going to get Laurian in here, but the Katie that Allison just referred to as Katie McPherson, who is the Chief Resilience Officer for the City of Vancouver. And it would be great if we could break those acronyms down as you just did, Al, when you mentioned one. That'd be great. Okay, Laurian, let's hear from you. As I said, transplanted Torontonian, now in New York City, which is the epicenter of so much of the challenge right now. Tell us what you're seeing, and also you have a global focus, and you're working with cities certainly around North America. So tell us what you're seeing.
Right. Well, I think Elliott's last point and what Allison was starting to talk about is perfect segue into what I'm working on. So I work at the Global Resilient Cities Network. We have 28 cities in our North America region. Fortunate to have 4 of those cities in Canada. Katie in Vancouver is our Chief Resilience Officer, as you mentioned, but we also work with Calgary, Toronto, and Montreal. And it's interesting to think about climate and COVID together, and resilience, because we're talking about systems. The cities in themselves as an entity are also a system. And when I think about the cities operating as a system to respond to these 2 major challenges, which is the only way I can really think about it, because the challenges are so complex, I have to break them down, right? So as a system, the cities right now, what they're telling us is that they're facing an existential threat just to maintain their viability as an entity, as a city. Their ability to maintain their essential operations is being compromised because the crippling loss of revenue because of the shutdown. They're not able to run their programs and their facilities. So we see cities such as Cape Town on the brink of declaring bankruptcy, DC, which was a city that could boast an enviable reserve, is really seriously concerned about how they're going to keep the lights on in the coming weeks. And so it's not, as a system, the cities have their own challenges. As Jeff mentioned, we have other threats that are looming. We have, we're on the brink of having hurricane season, as you mentioned, flooding, heat. The cascading effects on because of the shocks and the stresses that cities are building right now are mounting. And what I'm seeing in our cities is that they are already turning their minds to aggressively and quickly trying to rethink the plans that they already had in place to deal with some of these shocks, but to reframe them in the light of a COVID world. So how do you plan for heat emergencies when your usual direction to residents is to go to your cooling centers, and you can't have people.
You can't go to cooling centers.
In the cooling centers because of physical distancing. So that's a major concern. And then the final thought I'll leave with you on this is that there is a lot of opportunity coming down the pipe because of COVID. There will be a lot of funding flowing, stimulus packages. We in our group of cities, in our network of cities, we've been talking a long time about the resilience approach to operating in cities, to approaching every single project with a resilience lens to make sure that you realize co-benefits and that you utilize every single dollar to its maximum benefit, optimize every single dollar. The challenge is going to be, though, I think, with some of the funding is the pressure to act very quickly. Yeah. And the temptation to take shortcuts. And so we're already seeing, how should I put this? Environmental regulations being loosened because of COVID as an excuse. We need to be so careful that we stick to the processes that we know are effective in resilience approach. And you're going to hear me say this again and again, that we can't just recover, but we have to have a resilient recovery. If we're going to stop the cracks from widening, that Jeff was mentioning, the inequities, the problems that we already had in cities that we already knew existed. And this virus, what it has done is shone a spotlight on our existing problems. It's laid bare the cracks in our system. So we need to not only make sure that we stop the widening of these cracks, but ultimately we want to try and close some of the gaps as well in these cracks. And I think the best way to do that is through a holistic resilience approach.
Mm-hmm.
So could we talk a little bit about the notion of plans? I mean, a number of you have been involved in resilience plans, and I don't know if anybody else remembers being taught this in university about how we overlearn from history. You know, everybody assumed that World War II would look like World War I, and I'm concerned about how, let's take New Orleans, Jeff, where you and I were, you know, that the threat was always seen to be more hurricanes, and now all of a sudden we have a pandemic. And Laurian, you've been looking at hundreds of plans that cities, those 100 resilient cities all put together plans. Elliott, you were in the midst of it. I mean, how can we shift our thinking that we are resilient to a bunch of different kinds of challenges? And is it a skill set or a lens that, as you just suggested, that we can put to that that allows us to be able to cope with whatever's next? Because COVID may not be the next challenge we have to deal with. It's something else, right?
Yeah.
After you, Jeff.
I was just going to say to that. I mean, one of the things that we learned, Marian, you know this as much as anybody else, is, you know, there are things like social cohesion and other sort of skills that communities can build that sort of take you through any one of these, right? And I think, as Laurian was saying before, I think, you know, the ability to be resilient is to be resilient from sort of anything that comes your way. And that sounds sort of nebulous and esoteric, but that's actually the truth, right? So if you're building capacity, I'm taking sort of an example from Melbourne, Australia. If you're building capacity in the system to protect vulnerable elderly populations with food delivery services to them and other things, one of the things that they did in Melbourne is check on those people as you're delivering food to understand if they have proper cooling for when a heat wave comes, right? And so you're building those capacities in those systems in many different ways. And what we also know is that those communities who have the capacity to recover because of social cohesion and other things can weather many different types of shocks, right? Whether it be
but what we didn't anticipate is that you couldn't actually physically get together.
Well, exactly.
As Laurian just suggested, I mean, who thought? I don't know. I mean, of all the plans around the country and around in the 100 Resilient Cities Network, and also Allison in terms of CUSP, is there a particular community that anticipated specifically this kind of pandemic where people would have to be physically separated? Is there anybody that had the jump on this and knew that this might be coming?
Well, I can speak to our cities in the global network. I haven't seen anything that was specifically about social or physical, let's call it physical distancing.
Really?
There were a number of cities that did identify disease outbreak and pandemic and epidemics. And as Jeff said, the beauty of this type of planning, this holistic resilient planning, is that it can be adapted, right? Mm-hmm. So no, we didn't necessarily anticipate everyone needs to stay 2 meters apart. But the ability to adapt quickly to a new unknown shock and stress is what resilience is all about. And there are a lot of people working in the cities to quickly adapt plans that they already had in place to face this. Yeah.
But it is interesting. I mean, in that way, we have the technology. I mean, those of us that were involved with Katrina, there was no social media like this. There was, you were physically going to meetings and you were doing it the old fashioned way, pounding the pavement. In fact, a couple of webinars ago, we had someone say, we have to go back to good old analog systems, calling people on the phone, you know, bulletin boards, good old fashioned ways of doing it. So, I mean, at least we have connectivity that way, but not equally distributed connectivity. All right, well, let's move now to the question of money. Here's a question I have for all of you. I think that each of your work is dependent on capital. It has historically. That a lot of resilience plans and sustainability work is engaged in building infrastructure and spending capital dollars. Mm-hmm. Now we're looking at a situation where a lot of that capital money is probably going to get redeployed to just keeping lights on in operations. So is that what you were getting at, Allison? Some concern that maybe some of these projects are going to get slowed or shelved, or what do you think? Allison?
Yeah, I'm sorry. I'm just thinking of how to respond to that.
Yes, sure.
I mean, I just wanted to say one thing to the last point, which is that, you know, only in Canada do Calgary, Toronto, Montreal, and Vancouver did they have the luxury of having chief resilience officers, right? The majority of cities across Canada did not have that funding from 100 Resilient Cities and those brains embedded in their city manager's office. So for the most part, the other cities have at best adaptation plans, climate change adaptation plans, which for the most part really looked in the early days of those plans, which, you know, Equally Canada has been in the center of helping cities produce those plans. In the early days, those were really about hard solutions, looking at how to respond with dikes, and they weren't people-centered in the sense that they weren't looking at some of those social cohesion solutions that Laurian and Jeff were just talking about. So I just wanted to make.
But they've morphed, okay? But they have morphed. I mean, I think there's a sense that they've morphed.
So Equally continues to work with those cities in Canada, and they have centered equity as those plans are adapting, as their plans are evolving now. But historically, I think that was the big gap, is that we weren't looking at the strength and the resilience that could come from people. We were looking at it to come from the outside with hardscape for the most part. So financially, I mean, I think the issue is that, you know, we have municipalities have already, you know, municipalities in Canada are highly reliant on property tax revenue. That's all they've basically got.
And user fees.
Well, user fees are at best cost recovery. I mean, you know, you might have user fees on transit that people are talking about right now. TransLink burning $75 million a month, Toronto $65 million a week or something like that. But those aren't even cost recovery, right? We're still subsidizing those services heavily with property taxes and other revenue sources from senior levels of government.
Right.
So really the only thing to cover traditional core service has been property tax revenues and maybe a little bit of parking revenues for some of our urban centers. So we've already seen that those property tax revenues and the pressure to keep those increases low because of affordability issues in our cities is already broken, right? Like, I mean, we aren't covering what core services and what's considered discretionary services like climate action and some of our social planning work, for instance. We're not able to cover that currently with property tax revenues. And so cities are doing their best and they're doing an amazing job, don't get me wrong, but they are at capacity. And so when you throw something like COVID on top of it and you take away those user fees while they still have to provide the essential services of transit and others, and then you add another, $930,000 a month Ottawa is spending just in increased costs for solid waste, long-term care, and emergency response, the cash flows don't exist for that. And they have reserves, but those reserves are for infrastructure that is beyond the need for renewal and new infrastructure that is needed.
Yeah.
So what I could say I like out of this is that it's forcing a conversation that we've been pushing down the road for a really long time. Mm-hmm. And a new operating model and a new model for funding cities and these services is required, because the right place for these actions to take place is local, but the funding sources and the authorities that municipalities have are insufficient. And what we're seeing right now, just to finish, is a beautiful amount of collaboration across all levels of government, as well as in our communities with our frontline NGOs who have also suffered from being highly responsible for a huge vulnerable group in our cities and maintaining their livelihood without certainty and stability of funding. And I think we're seeing now how important those frontline organizations are and how important it is to provide them with stability and certainty so they can do the work that they're there to do and not be out looking for funding every single year.
Yeah.
I guess
I want to respond to one of the questions that you asked there. You said, because you sort of thread the needle that, we have these plans. Are the projects going to be shelved? And I would say that the answer is no. What we're seeing in reality is that municipalities are using something called operating from capital, which is not really what they're supposed to do, right? They're taking money from capital budgets, which are meant to be separated, and they're subsidizing operating. That's, of course, quite risky in normal times, which is why we don't do it. I would say it's probably much less risky right now because the cities unquestionably are going to get bailed out. They have to get bailed out. There's no other option, really, in the Canadian context. And then so the capital reserves will be lower, but I don't think that will result in shelved projects at all. I think that what we're going to see is a very significant infrastructure-focused stimulus that's going to come. And anyone who has completed those plans, who has projects ready, like a tower renewal project in Toronto, or a home energy loan program, or the low carbon cities program, or things like that, that can be vehicles for the federal government to provide funding to cities, are actually going to be in a very good place. And just very quickly to respond to Laurian's question about, or point rather, that we're seeing some restrictions relaxed and so on. I think that's correct. But one of the advantages that we have in Canada is that Infrastructure Canada has provided, I think, significant leadership with the climate lens assessment. And I don't think there is a chance, and maybe I'll be embarrassed because this is going to be recorded later on, but I don't think there is a chance that Minister McKenna, who was previously the Environment Minister, is going to relax the climate lens assessment requirement. So I think that we are actually going to see GHG assessments and resilience assessments done of all of those projects that are funded federally.
We spoke with Ickley before, and Eva Jackson and Megan have taught me a lot about how they've approached resilience for a couple of decades since Ickley was formed. And they talk about multi-solving, this notion that my simple language of this was that you never want to make an investment that only delivers one benefit. You have to do something that not only boosts resilience but increases livability. And this lens is, this lens tool, this protocol that's been in place. Are there other kinds of safeguards that we think we should be advocating for now? I mean, I hear you, Laurian, about is the urgency. The good thing is that there is going to be stimulus money. The bad thing about that, and we know this from our work with, the work of Jane Jacobs around cataclysmic money. Like, there's a problem when a lot of money comes flooding in. And Jeff and I experienced it in New Orleans, it can cause a lot of problems if too much comes in. And then there's urgency, not only to get things happening, but also to get people back to work. So are there particular kinds of policy directions or principles that the four of you are mulling around in your head that need to start being put out into the practice, that people understand here are the four things that we have to be cognizant of as we plan and make investments? Jeff, you're nodding your head. Got any thoughts on that?
I was just going to say, building off of Elliott's comment, I mean, I think there is a huge concern that budgetarily across many cities in the US, many of our clients, about how to continue to move their projects forward. And you'll see in the media a lot of conversations about the municipal bond market and what's trying to sort of loosen up there to make sure that that doesn't completely collapse for capital projects. But what I've seen happen is not necessarily a retraction, but actually really thinking creatively about how to get projects funded, which frankly are making them think a little bit more systematically about the types of funding that will likely be available and is already being made available. So we've been tracking all of the federal stimulus monies, all of the packages, all of the different sort of sources, and understanding the regulations around each of them, because I think it's going to be more of a stacking of funds or looking at different types of programs to fund a project to move it forward. And I think a lot of cities, particularly those who have had sort of a lot of strategy work on the front end, are really trying to move that forward, still a little cautiously, because not all of it is sort of wrapped up right now about what these packages are actually going to look like. But as Elliott said, I think there's going to be a strong focus on infrastructure investment from stimulus. And I think a lot of the cities, I'm thinking of New York and Miami and others who have done a lot of this work, are trying to align those projects to that funding in order to move those projects forward. I would say the biggest thing that I've been thinking about and we've been advising our clients is that this is the opportunity to make a different choice, right? In recovery, you can get recovery, the funds, as you said, Mary, come in and you want to deploy it, right? It's about how fast you can get it out there, regardless of really good program design, right? This is the opportunity to take a leadership stance and create a program design that is actually transformational for the communities that need it most, and transformational around climate, and not just a business as usual case to move it forward. And
can we do it quickly enough? That's the question.
We can. I think I think we can. There's been a lot of work done over the past decade. I think many cities have the strategies in place, even if they don't have specific resilience strategies. Most of them have been thinking about this. The component organization USDN in the United States, Sustainability Directors Network. I mean, all these organizations have been doing this work. It's about positioning those ideas to the funding that's going to be available and not missing this opportunity to do so.
Allison's CUSP is a Canadian version of the USDN. They were sister organizations. And do you want to say something, Allison, about this?
Well, I was just going to say we're actually we're the Canadian partner network to USDN. So the Canadian members in USDN are CUSP members, and that's where we formed out of.
Allison, do you think we're going to make a shift? Do you think that this is a moment for the climate community, that you can actually move away from mitigation to adaptation or whatever it is? Is this a moment is this a crisis that you don't want to waste that could actually build climate change where it needs to go?
I mean, there's some terrible opportunities to be taken here, I think, for sure. And I think, to Jeff's point, this is not a technological problem that we've been having. It's structural and relational. And what we've seen in the last month is that we can shift those structures, and we can build those relationships quickly, and we can tap into the relationships that already exist. So there are a lot of networks at the local and national and provincial level, whatever, that already exist. And through this last month, we've taken advantage of those, because you can't just walk into a room and expect somebody to trust you.
Mm-hmm.
And these networks already have that built trust. And that's particularly true when it comes to working with your marginalized communities.
Mm-hmm.
And since we know that they are disproportionately impacted by COVID, by climate change, by everything,
Mm-hmm.
It's really important that we support and work with those networks that are already connected through there. So yeah, I think it's structural is our main problem. I think it's about power sharing down to the local level, power sharing into our frontline communities, and that we've already seen in the last month that we're capable of that. And I think now, you know, CUSP's focus has been on climate and equity and the nexus of those two, working on energy poverty and other things. That's really what we've been focusing on the last couple of years. And so that's great for the 17 cities we work with, but the change in people's perception around energy, equity and affordability has been growing over the last couple of years, but it's gone off the charts in the last month. We know that anyone is 2 months paycheck away from needing financial support. We don't need to fight for universal basic income anymore. We have a Canadian emergency response right now that is proving that that's exactly how we can do it. We've been saying we couldn't possibly roll out a basic income program. Yeah, we can. We just did it. We did it in 3 days. So we know that we can do that. And we know, and I think there's a new national value and belief that any one of us is literally 2 or 3 paychecks away
Vulnerable.
from needing some financial support. And we don't need to ask them why they need it.
Right. You know, it's as you suggest, this nothing like a crisis to make a conversation happen. You know, conversations that weren't happening are now happening. And as you suggest, things that seem to be completely impossible, no, we've been able to actually find a way to do it. So I guess that's a larger question. Do you think that we'll be able to, even at a very practical level, are we seeing changes in urban life right now that are temporary that in fact should stick? So there's lots of questions about car use, for instance, and the hardening of bike lanes. Does anybody have a sense of this? Is this something we can extract from this crisis and have them be implemented on a more long-term basis? Laurian, what do you think in terms of the GRCN network?
Absolutely. I think we're seeing a global pilot study in some of the complete streets theories that cities have been struggling to push on a broader scale. I think it was Milan just today has announced that they're converting permanently 22 kilometers of their streets to bike lanes. And then there will be a shift in what normal means for society. We don't know yet what that shift is going to be, but there will be a shift. And now is our opportunity to seize that moment to define what we want that shift to be, right? And from a climate lens, from a health lens, and the two are so interconnected. Just getting back to one of Elliott's points about projects may not be shelved just because of this crisis. And I think they definitely won't be, because many of the climate actions that have been put forward by cities will actually help address some of these climate health issues, or the human health issues as well. So I think we need to keep pushing forward some of the good ideas that are already out there, the expertise of people that are already working in cities and in NGOs, and define what that new normal is going to be for us, and make permanent some of these changes that we're seeing in this really short time, make them long term. And I think it's possible.
You know, one of the problems with the concept of resilience is that nasty, bad things are resilient too, right? Milton Friesen's just raised this in the chat. And I remember Tracy Washington in New Orleans at the Louisiana Justice Center, Jeff, pushed back on you and I all the time, saying, you're using resilience as a term to give an excuse to do something bad to me again and again and again, because gee, look how resilient I am, or look how resilient disadvantaged people are. So I'm curious about whether we can actually get to a place where people understand that this is a positive concept, and that it's something that now we have no excuse. A bit like what you were saying, Allison, we didn't think we could do a basic annual income, now we're doing it. are we going to get to a place where people just agree, of course, we don't do an investment unless it leads to resilience? Can we get to that place?
I'll say quickly, I mean, I think there are, in the US context, I think there are going to be places in the US who have sort of led a lot of these conversations before, that this will be the point which completely pivots them to make those decisions.
Like a tipping point. Do you think
like
we're
a
at?
tipping point. Right, like places like California and other places, I think they're there. I mean, there's conversations about these types of things in New York. And then I think, just given our context, there will be other parts of the United States who will do business as usual. And we will continue to see sort of a bifurcation of those that are moving forward and those that are, in my opinion, who will be continue to be left behind.
So do you think that's what will happen? Is we're going to get? I mean, if what I hear Allison espousing is a real devolution to the local, and again, that's been my experience. The two cities that are on this call, I lived in during these stresses, so I know it really does devolve. That local folks have the solutions and they need the resources. Do you think we'll get to a place where some places will get with the program and some just will opt not to? And are we okay with that?
I'm not okay with it, but I think that's the reality.
Elliott, what do you think?
I was listening to what Jeff said with a lot of interest. I mean, I don't. Okay, we've heard the optimistic side. I think there is also the pessimistic side when it comes to climate change around models, right? Because a lot of our response right now, and you hear it every time the province or the feds are going to release a new model, everyone's kind of, right on the edge of their seat. And the figures that came out from Ontario, it looks like we're going to have 1/4 the number of cases that were projected just a few weeks ago. So I think that, one of the things that I take away from that that's quite interesting as we think about the climate emergency for cities is that we need to make sure that we have the science right and communicated in a way that's actually relatable. Because if we say, for example, we need to build, flood resilience to a certain level, and we way over engineer it, and we can't justify why, then we're going to have some, if we say that these green swans coming and they don't come, we're going to have some issues there. So on the pessimistic side, I would say, we shouldn't be too carried away with our excitement about the collective action. And we need to really keep our eyes on, keep our climate scientists and keep our focus on getting the facts right.
I mean, that part is good, that there has been an appreciation that expertise actually matters. I think that, at least in our jurisdictions, we don't live in the political reality you live in, Jeff and Laurian. It's different here, probably in a good way. But I do think there are going to be fundamental questions for us around, as you suggest, Elliott, what are the priorities? So we don't have anybody on this call from Alberta. If we did, they'd be talking about what is going to be the impact of the complete collapse in the oil and gas industry, and what is that going to do to what has it already done to their economy, and what are the options for them? Has anybody done some thinking about this, about ultimately what that impact might look like? Or are we all just struggling with ourselves?
It's a conversation I've been having with our colleague Marissa in Houston. As they have these dual issues right now, with the complete collapse of the oil economy and also COVID, and also really a lot of being very nervous about the upcoming hurricane season, as well as disruptions that heat will have. So I think people are really trying to figure this all out. I mean, there's a lot of economic analysis going on all the impacts, but for a city like Houston, which is highly dependent on the energy economy, could this be a shift in the economy? This did happen in the 1980s, and it really pivoted Houston to really diversify its economy a bit more than it was previously. So,
but not so much its built form, right? And that's the other question. As we see more and more people reacting so negatively to density, are we going to see now more pressure to de-densify, and what are the environmental implications? I would think that the climate community is a bit concerned about that. Allison, are you? We're going to go back to car culture?
Well, I mean, Well, I would hope not. I mean, I don't.
Right. Me too.
I don't think so. I don't know why car culture. I mean, will we have a white flight from the cities out to the suburbs like we did in the 80s in Detroit and other places? No, I don't think so. I think we know better than that. I think our cities deliver more than that. We need to make sure that the level of service that we're able to provide in cities is high, it's equitable, and it's affordable. And I think if we're doing those things, then cities are a great place to live, to raise families, and to run businesses. So that's I think in the past with our climate work, collectively, it's been more focused on the greenhouse gas reduction side, on the mitigation side than adaptation. I think the funding has also been so. I think we need to be looking at resilience now as the as the goal we're looking for. We're looking for a just recovery here into a regenerative economy that builds resilient communities. And a resilient community in a rural area is different than a resilient community in an urban area. And as such, our funding programs can't be one size fits all. So where the connection I see between COVID and climate change is, in COVID situation in the rural areas, it's about access. It's about access to healthcare. It's about access to broadband. That is the inequity and the injustice that they're experiencing right now. And similarly, when it comes to our greenhouse gas or to climate change, it is around building adaptation and making those communities adaptable, but then it's around access still there too. It's around access to clean and affordable energy. And in northern and remote communities, it's also around energy justice. It's around the right to self-determination by Indigenous people to have independent power production so that they can, meet their reconciliation and self-determination goals through local energy power production. So again, in rural areas, it's about access, just as it is here around healthcare and broadband. Why would we be putting the same amount of dollars into seeking greenhouse gas reductions in rural areas when we know that the consumption, the buildings, the transportation are in urban areas? If we're seeking greenhouse gas reductions to meet those climate targets, that funding needs to go to the larger cities where the people are and where the consumption and the greenhouse gas generation exists. And it's not to say that there isn't funding that needs to go into rural areas, but we need to think about what we're putting money into rural areas and what goals. And it's around access to healthcare, access to clean and affordable energy, access to broadband.
There are, in the chat box, people are putting up ideas and existing programs. And again, just to remind people in the chat box that the resources that you post here, we'll make sure are circulated. We'll put them in the posting when we put this online as well. Who else just wanted to jump in? Elliott?
I just wanted,
or Jeff, one of you.
I'll just go quickly. One of the things that I've been tracking are all of the photographs and things of cities that are experiencing amazing days because of low emissions and freedom of movement and all these other things, and just how wonderful that's been. And one of the things that I've been wondering, and Allison, this is maybe a question for you, but I'm wondering how that will impact sort of, the populace. Like, it is something that we can actually see now, like this huge, this shock has allowed us to see something in real time that many of us have been talking about. And will that have sort of a psychological impact on the way the average person views climate change, which has been sort of a distant thing for a lot of people, but the reaction to actually seeing it happen in real time may have some sort of transformative impact on the way we think about it. It's amazing to see what has happened in such a short period of time.
And is there some way for that to be done and still maintain social distancing?
Right.
So, I'm agreeing with you, because does it have to be, well, if we all stay home all the time, gee, the climate will do okay. Well, that's probably not sustainable. Elliott, you were trying to jump in.
Well, there's just one thing, from Allison's list of things, and talking about urban and rural, that I think we have missed in this conversation, is that everyone experiences resilience at home. And we haven't talked about homes. In the Toronto Resilience Strategy, basically our number 1 and number 2 recommendations were that we needed to improve people's resilience at home and in apartment towers. So that seems like a really great recommendation at this point. We're seeing, buildings are the number 1 or number 2 source of emissions in most Canadian cities. And we're seeing a big shift from commercial real estate value to home value as people are going to start working from home more remote stuff like that. So I think one thing that we haven't really talked about is that opportunity to advance concepts like tower renewal or home energy loan programs, broadband at home, water at home for northern communities. So, and I really think that home resilience angle is a principle that we need to think about when we look at recovery.
And it gives people a reference point. It's easier to wrap your head around it, right? Yeah. Laurian, trying to get in on that too?
100%. I think that there is, so going back to my thinking around systems, people tend to forget about their individual impact and look to the cities, to the governments to solve a lot of problems. And so 100% I agree with Elliott. We also as individuals need to look at what we can do on our own lives. Look how hard it is to get people to prepare 72-hour emergency kits, just to be responsible for their own food and water for 3 days, because the government may not be able to, the emergency management responders may not be able to get to them because of the tax on resources. This beautiful experience we're having of lower pollution, is it going to be enough to change people's mindsets to take permanent action? And this is where I feel like we need all the support from the anthropologists and the sociologists to figure out how do we capture this feeling that people have today and translate that into a more permanent commitment to individual actions. And what are we all willing to do to get to this desired outcome, besides just writing our MPs and our congressmen and saying, hey, we need to do better? Like, what are we going to demand of them to do better? And,
you know, you started, when you started, Laurian, you said response to, you said there's sort of a phasing that we're going through, right? Stabilization and things. I mean, do you think that in this, I don't know, that when we get beyond stabilization, will we be able to extract the things that actually worked well, that we want in our own lives? Gee, I think it was good not to go shopping so frequently, or whatever it was, you know? How will people, how can we remind people? Actually, there were good things about this, not just trauma.
Many people will change their behaviors because of this. Many people will not. As Jeff said, same with cities. Many cities will use this as an inflection, a pivot point to do better, and many will revert back to their old comfort zones. And unfortunately, we're living in a system that has been built on decades and decades, hundreds of years of decisions that are very hard to step back from. You know, we're so embedded in these old decisions that have been made for society. This is why we have equity issues. This is why we have the current economic system that we live in. This is why we have the energy system that we live in, because of decisions that we've made. We need to start to walk back some of those decisions to get to that outcome. It's a challenge. And so I think it's going to take all of the disciplines working together to figure out how to address that challenge. But that's essentially what we do. So the answer for you, Mary, is I think some of us will, but we've got a long way to go. We have a long way to go to overcome that barrier. And the other thing I wanted to mention is that, you know, Elliott spoke about the models and the science, and we like to believe that people are, you know, interested and trusting of the science now, finally, right? But the models can only get us so far, because models are trying to simulate a real life system. Like, how are we going to accurately model climate change when we don't really even understand all the parameters that need to go into it? So the models give us a guide, and they don't give us the solutions. So we need to decide another main decision of what systems we want to live within, and then we need to be ready to adapt to the outcomes of those solutions. And we give ourselves the best fighting chance we can. We pick the best, we decide what our risk tolerance is, and we move forward. But it starts with the models, but I don't think the models are the be all and end all. And so I think as a culture, we started to put up these statistics and models, and then we, even just the weatherman, look at how we like to berate the weatherman for getting the weather wrong, right? Yeah. Culture, we've done this. So we need to start rethinking how we accept data as well and how we use our data.
Spoken like a true engineer.
Mary, can I say one thing?
Hang on, Jeff. I want to go to Allison first and then to you, Jeff. Go ahead, Al.
Yep.
Allison.
I just wanted to say, you know, I think, you know, we talk about needing some shovel-ready plans right now for when the money comes out. And you know, what we know is we have, you know, of my 17 cities, 14 have declared climate emergencies. All of them have very new climate plans. They know what they need. They know what their 6 big moves are, or their, you know, their game changers are. Don't fund projects, fund strategies, fund it down to the city level, let them implement those strategies over multiple years. And we know we have 14 coal-fired power plants. We know that they need to be offline by 2029. Let's accelerate that. Let's get the money into those communities to do that. We know we need ubiquitous and equitable networks of EV charging stations. Those don't need to be, you know, we're not going to anybody's house to install EV charging stations in parkades and parking lots in the public realm. Let's get that money out there. Let's do that. And with all of those capital dollars needs to come the recognition that there's people and capacity required to deliver them well. And in particular, if we want to deliver them intentionally to meet these other goals and to make sure that they're delivered equitably and inclusively to all, so that no one gets left behind.
Yeah, literally. Okay, Jeff?
Yeah, just really quickly, and that's perfect, building off of what Allison said and really going back to what Elliott said. One of the things that's very practical about what they both said is that a lot of those programs already exist at the federal level, both in Canada and the US, and they just need more funding. That's a very practical thing to advocate for. They likely already exist. They just have a pittance of funds as opposed to what they actually need. And if we can push more funds into those types of programs, particularly around home resilience, as Elliott says, those are programs that already exist. They just need more money.
And they need to be more streamlined. We need to streamline those and deliver those dollars down without project by project application.
Yep.
You know, we're going to wrap here, and I'm just going to say a couple things. One is that, you know, it's a very different world than it was 15 years ago when both Jeff Hebert and I were living in New Orleans, and we started talking about resilience, and people went, huh? The only people that knew what resilience was were psychologists, because it was used in psychodynamic understandings of individual resilience. And now, 15 years later, it's a term that at least people understand. The points that all of you have been raising, we've laid some track here. We have some muscle memory. You guys have been working in these fields diligently, creating networks, connecting expertise with practitioners on the ground, seeing if you can ladder that up to good policy. You've been at it for a long time. Now's our moment to see if we can really go full throttle and use those muscles we've been training and see if we can join them up. The last thing I just want to suggest is, if this notion of shovel ready, this is a broad concept that everybody gets, shovel ready. I'd love us to come up with a term that suggests that we as human beings are ready, that are it may not be shovel ready. Is it resilience ready? Is it the new normal ready? That we understand that we're all going to change now and move into a different kind of understanding of our relationship to the natural environment and to each other. So I want to thank everybody for coming on the call and being part of this. We'll keep the chat, we'll archive the chat. As I suggested, hopefully we'll put a video up of what these folks have been talking about. The conversation continues briefly on this chat. The chat function will stay live for a few minutes if you want to keep exchanging thoughts, chatters. Thanks for all your comments. And we'll post it, as I suggested, on canrb.org. Later this week, we have 2 more sessions. On Thursday, we're talking about libraries that have had to be extraordinarily resilient and have repurposed themselves and reinventing themselves. What's the future for libraries? It's on everybody's street. What's going to happen, and what kinds of lessons are they learning? And then on Friday, we have a one-on-one, one of our first conversations with the mayor. We're going to have a live city chat with the mayor of Victoria. Allison, your mayor, Lisa Helps, will be with us. So thanks everybody for joining with us on City Talk, and please continue the conversation online and hashtag City Talk. And again, we thank you very much for joining us. Thanks, gang.
Thank you.
Thank you.